I'm Ellie, and the last thing I expected to happen after I slid the last dish onto the table was to be accused of being a parasite. I'd spent the whole week juggling shifts and spreadsheets so I could afford a proper Thanksgiving for the three of them. I cooked the turkey, memorized my grandmother's stuffing recipe, and made a pie that didn't collapse into a sad, floury pancake. I'd also paid the electric bill that month because the card tied to family expenses had mysteriously stopped working the week before. I paid for groceries, for a minor car repair, and for the pizza the kids at the church handed out when we ran low on cranberry sauce. People who aren't me would call that normal. My family called it expected. My father, Greg, cleared his throat like he was getting ready to announce an award. My mother, Diane, was busy rescuing gravy that refused to cooperate. I set down my bowl, wiped my hands, and sat. The house smelled like sage and butter, and the kind of quiet you only get when everyone is trying to pretend everything is fine. "Ellie," Greg said, like he was about to tack a ribbon onto me. "You're a leech." That line landed with the weird, slow heat of someone dropping a panful of grease on the floor. I laughed, because what else do you do when a person you fed their whole life calls you a parasite at the table? Greg didn't smile back. He folded his napkin with the kind of satisfaction people get from finishing a crossword puzzle. "You should move out," he added, voice flat and absolute, as if he were reading terms and conditions, and I had no right to disagree. At that moment, the turkey wasn't the only thing overcooked. The humiliation tasted metallic in my mouth. I could hear every dollar I'd pushed his way. The last 4 months of utilities, the car insurance I paid, so Diane could drive to her appointments, the grocery tabs that had eaten into my savings, clink like coins falling down a drain. I'd booked my life into a ledger, and the person whose signature had been on the family column felt fine about asking me to erase myself from it. Who am I in the shorthand of that room? The person who brings casserole dishes and picks up the check. The woman who cleans up the kitchen and logs expenses into a spreadsheet at midnight so we don't mess this up again. The one who keeps a mental list of who owes what and pretends it's not a list of favors that never get repaid. I'm the one who thought family meant safety, not arithmetic. There's a ridiculous, very specific sound that grief makes when it's not allowed to be grief. It becomes a tight, incredulous laughter that you can't turn off. I laughed. I told him he was being ridiculous. Diane put her hand on his arm, like he was a decorative cushion she wanted to keep from being upset. Nobody asked me if I wanted to move out. Nobody asked how long it takes to find a deposit when you've been bonking at the bottom of your own savings because you were busy propping up everyone else's. What's at stake here wasn't just a couch or a room with my name on it. It was the idea that my labor, emotional labor, financial, domestic, counted for something. It was my savings, which I'd been thinning to keep the household afloat while Greg padded an account I didn't know existed. It was the pride it pied. It was the years of being the default caretaker. It was the access, the safe place, the small rituals of family dinners that proved I belonged. When you hear the person who gave you your first bicycle tell you to leave his house like you're the problem, it rearranges your bones. It makes you notice all the little compromises you had made because family, and suddenly they look less noble and more negotiable. In that browned kitchen glow, I realized the fight wasn't about the turkey or the gravy or even the money. It was about whether I would let my life be defined by other people's convenience. I cleared the table, more out of habit than defiance. Every plate scraped against ceramic and echoed with the things I hadn't said yet. I'd been the banker, the chef, the bill scheduler, the emotional triage nurse for a long time. Whatever I did next had to protect the part of me that still wanted to breathe without calculating whether a stray tire rotation would bankrupt me. So I left the dishes in the sink and stood in my doorway with my coat on. Greg watched me go with the casual certainty of a man who believes eviction notices are moral judgments. Diane mouthed something I couldn't hear. Maybe an apology, maybe a prayer. I kept my hand on the doorknob until the sound of the house settled back into its comfortable hum. Then I stepped out into the cold, feeling oddly relieved that something had finally been said aloud. If this is how Thanksgiving starts, I thought, then it's a very good thing it's also where something else begins. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with an enormous mug of coffee and the spreadsheet that had kept our family pretending to be solvent. I'd called it House Shared once, because I was the kind of person who named folders like they were endangered species. The columns were neat: utilities, groceries, insurance, Diane, medical. Every line item had a date, a vendor, and a little note in parentheses where I recorded what I'd paid and when. My thumb found the scab of a paper cut I'd earned opening an envelope of another unpaid bill last week, and I realized I had been doing other people's budgeting as a hobby for so long, I'd started to believe it was joy. It took me 30 minutes to climb the learning curve of rage to something slightly more useful: focus. I logged into the family accounts I had access to. The credit card my name was on for groceries, the utility autopay I'd set up, the car insurance renewal I'd painlessly paid because the policy was under Greg's name, and I liked quiet mornings when the mail still smelled like paper. What I saw made my stomach go cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the turkey. There were withdrawals, not the little ones, large transfers going out every 2 weeks. They were labeled in a way that tried to be innocent: savings transfer. I traced one to a second bank I'd never seen, an account under Greg's name that had ballooned while I was doing rounds of "please don't cancel the internet." The dates aligned with the months I'd been short on rent, and the months Diane needed help for yet another of her procedures. I sat there with my mouth full of coffee and my savings balance dwindling on my phone, and suddenly felt like my life was a badly edited film where the villain had slipped his name into the credits under family. I printed everything: receipts, last 4 months of autopays, screenshots of transfers. The printer whined and spat out my evidence the way a fountain spits out confession. The spreadsheet looked different on paper, less like a helpful ledger and more like a ledger of theft. Plumber, $250. Electric, $180. Mom, $600. Botox-ish? I didn't need a forensic accountant to see the pattern. I needed someone who could tell me what to do next. First practical step: cut the bleeding. I called the credit card company and explained, calmly and deliberately, that I would be removing the family card from automatic payments on my accounts, and that any further charges I had not authorized would be disputed. They asked for verification. I had it: copies, timestamps, my neat, annoying spreadsheet that had kept us afloat. I canceled the autopay to Greg's account, closed my name off the grocery card, and set up a new account in my own name only. New routing, new password, new email that no one in the house knew. It felt like changing the locks on a life you'd been asked to share. Second practical step: minimize contact. I scheduled those small bureaucratic acts you don't realize are weapons until you need them. Changed passwords, moved recurring deposits off my old joint account, put two-step verification on my phone, and put a travel alert on my banking app, so any new device logging in would ping me like a security guard. I stopped accepting Venmo requests that were framed as household help, and I refused to let my PayPal be the family piggy bank. I kept copies of everything on a thumb drive that I tucked into a cereal box like some worse-for-wear spy. In between ripping autopay cords out of our shared life, I started to tell people. Elaine answered the first time I texted her at 2 a.m. "Come over. You sound like you need soup." Elaine is the kind of friend who makes you laugh when you want to shout, and somehow that's exactly what I needed. She lived in a place 2 subway stops away with better light and worse plants. When I showed up with a suitcase and a pie tin, because habits die hard, she handed me a towel like she does in a play when someone finally stops pretending everything is fine. "Move in for a bit," she said. "You can use my spare room, and my Netflix, and my low standards for housekeeping." Elaine isn't one of those cliffside friends who explains away life with metaphors. She's practical. A green-inked teacher's planner of the human species. She helped me open my new account in the kitchen while we ate leftover stuffing for breakfast, and laughed at the fact that I was both furious and still able to critique the seasoning of reheated turkey. She took mail for me, filed things, and sat with me while I drafted emails to utility companies explaining the changes. She's the person who forced me to sleep when my mind wanted to open another tab and fold my anger into more tabs. The emotional work was heavier. I had to tell myself that wanting my money back, or honestly, wanting my money to stop vanishing, didn't make me petty. It made me capable. I rehearsed phrases in the shower. I will be removing my name from that account. I will no longer be covering household expenses. I need the receipts. They're small sentences, but they felt like picking up tiny weights until my arms would work again. I also recorded everything. Not dramatic recordings, just voice memos of dates and times and the text messages that had once been excuses and then became confessions in their own way. Dad, we're tight this month. I'm saving for something. You don't have to do everything. The italicized lie of "we're tight" felt like sand slipping through both my hands as he made a plan to buy a boat. The idea of him looking at a hull while I cut coupons made the anger taste metallic, but it also clarified something important. It wasn't personal drama, it was policy. My grandfather taught me to split wood by looking at where the grain wanted to go. I was doing the same with my life, finding the path of least resistance and taking it. I made a choice, dirty and deliberate. My help would no longer be the household's default. I emailed landlords and insurers, closed the old grocery card, and sent a single clear message to the family group chat I had been muted in more often than I'd realized. Starting today, I will be handling only my personal bills. I have a record of what I paid, and will share it if you want copies. No lectures. No justifications. The message landed in the thread like a door being shut. Of course, someone had to be the sacrificial anchor, and it wasn't going to be me anymore. I started to move my savings cautiously into accounts that required in-person sign-off for major transfers. I set up alerts for transfers over a certain amount. Small, boring bureaucracy, but effective bureaucracy. The kind that turns into a moat if you tend the stones. The fallout happened faster than I expected. Diane called once, voiced like a weather report that had suddenly turned to thunder. "The utilities are being cut off," she said, "and the insurance is..." The panic was real, but the sentence inside my head that had been rehearsed since Thanksgiving kicked in. "I am not your bank." I sent her the list of companies and the dates, and I told her what I'd changed. She begged. I stayed calm. Begging on a phone line has a softness to it that guilt finds comforting. It did not move me. Elaine sat beside me while I clicked send and slid a mug of tea into my hand like a tiny, necessary treaty. There was a moment, too, where I savored a small, private satisfaction. I let the family card used for groceries decline at the corner store while I watched from across town, and I felt, stupidly, unreasonably, victorious. It wasn't petty. It was a boundary, shaped like a declined swipe and the sudden, short silence on the other end of the phone that followed. Everything wasn't resolved. I still didn't know how much Greg had tucked away, and the idea that he was planning a boat while Diane called me in the middle of the night for money felt like an infraction against some unwritten rule of decency I'd been paying to enforce. But the tight coil in my chest loosened a little with each practical action. Each password changed, each autopay canceled, each receipt saved. I was rewriting the terms, one bureaucratic paragraph at a time. Packing up in Elaine's spare room the first week felt like admitting both defeat and survival. The orange blanket on the spare bed had a yarn that snagged on my sweater, and when I pulled the sweater free, a loop came loose and I laughed. I had been the person who held everyone together and the threads had frayed. Now I was learning to weave myself a new hem. That's the thing about betrayal. It either breaks you or makes you meticulous. I chose meticulous. I made spreadsheets for my own rent, my own electric, my own leisure, and I named that spreadsheet Ellie Spend. It was satisfyingly selfish and perfectly legal. Elaine taught me to cook for one properly, which felt like a superpower. She also forced me to admit I deserved a space where my name was on the mailbox. When I walked past my parents' house on the way to work that week, I saw Greg in the driveway waving at some catalog full of boats. He looked like a man who thought the world owed him a deck and a nameplate. I felt something like a legal notice bubble coldly through me, precise and businesslike. My anger had a plan now. It wasn't just a thing I carried. I had locks, ledgers, and legal moves in motion. I had a friend who would let me crash on her futon and make fun of me for buying new comforters instead of therapy. There was a dangerous, delicious clarity to it. I was financially insulated, emotionally sober, and learning how to be selfish in a way that didn't feel cruel. The house was silent behind me. The spreadsheet sat in a file folder labeled evidence. The next step was to make sure the evidence meant something. I had the receipts. I had the screenshots. I had a list of every time I had been asked to fund someone's emergency that turned out to be elective. The rising action felt less like a melodrama and more like a carefully stacked set of dominoes. I placed them with precision, not malice. I'd been generous for years because I thought generosity was the circuit that kept our family alive. Now I was rebuilding the circuit so it didn't short out my life. The revenge I was planning wasn't dramatic. It was decisive. It would come when the time was right, and when it did, it would be less like thunder and more like a utility bill. Clear, final, and impossible to ignore. The phone rang before dawn, a thin, frantic sound that made my stomach flip in a way no coffee could fix. It was Diane. Her voice had the elastic quality panic gives, stretched tight, liable to snap. "They've cut the power," she said, "and Greg says the car insurance is... Ellie, please, you have to help." I listened, and while part of me wanted to slide back into the old script, give, calm, repair, another part had learned how to breathe through the chaos. "I already changed what I could," I said, voice steady the way you take a temperature when someone else has the flu. I told her which companies to call, which numbers to use, and that I'd left copies of the receipts in a folder at the post office for her to pick up if she wanted. She cried a little, which pulled at places I still cared about, but the begging nozzle had been injured by too many false alarms. I would help where it made sense, but I would not be the household's indefinite safety net. That evening, I was at Elaine's, methodically unpacking a box of things I hadn't wanted to admit I'd need. Extra chargers, that mug Elaine called the emergency mug, a tiny hammer I kept for broken picture frames. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Is this Ellie? Greg's here." Then nothing for a beat, and then the pounding. You know that sound. Loud, deliberate, like someone trying to drum their way into a life that's shut the door on them. It started at the building entrance, then escalated. Boots on concrete, a voice shouting my name. I'd told Greg where I'd sheltered. I hadn't exactly announced it, but in a small neighborhood, news travels fast. I locked the deadbolt, swallowed, and called the police. When someone you used to rely on starts battering the door of the person who's kept you alive, the sentimentality you saved for their birthday evaporates. Greg was 3 steps past pleading when the cops arrived. Loud, red-faced, insistently entitled. He shoved at the door, splintering a bit of the frame, and shouted into the hallway that he needed to talk this out. Elaine stood behind me with her arms folded like a bouncer who'd learned early how boundary enforcement beats a bad mood. The police took statements. They were patient and precise, the kind of people who turn human chaos into paperwork and a phone number you call when someone won't stop knocking. Greg paced on the stoop like a caged animal. The officer asked if I wanted to press charges. I didn't want to escalate for cruelty's sake. I wanted to be safe. I requested a temporary restraining order, and the officer told Greg he had to step away from the building. He left with a scowl that looked expensive and a limp promise to settle this. I filed for the order the next morning. I gave the court my list of incidents. The money transfers, the canceled auto pays, Diane's frantic calls, the late night pounding. I included the receipts, the spreadsheet, the screenshots, the voice memo where Greg had said, "I'm saving for something." I'd printed everything with the clinical, compulsive neatness of someone who realizes evidence is the language institutions understand. Then came the discovery that felt like salt. Diane admitted, voice small, that she'd pawned my old laptop and my camera. They said collateral, she told me over the phone. They needed money, and I thought it would be okay. I heard the rationalizations forming like storm clouds. I asked for the pawn receipts. She didn't have them. I walked back through my organized paper trail and cross-referenced serial numbers. The camera's model and serial were tucked into an old email where I'd registered the warranty years ago. The laptop's sticker number sat in a receipt I'd saved for insurance purposes. The pawn shop had scanned the serials when they took the items. With the police report in hand and the serial numbers lined up, I went to the station and filed theft by conversion. They'd taken my property and treated it as someone else's. The pawn shop clerk was apologetic once we produced the paperwork. He had the sort of face that regrets paperwork but appreciates cash. He reached under the counter and handed me the camera, its strap limp but otherwise intact, and the laptop, which booted up with the tired blue glow of a machine that had seen better Netflix marathons. I remember holding the camera and feeling ridiculous relief. The physical proof that I hadn't lost everything, to the kinds of excuses that sound honest when you're tired. Meanwhile, the restraining order came through as a legal sheet that felt both formal and oddly soothing. Greg was ordered to stay away from my residence, Elaine's apartment, my workplace, and any other place I frequented. He wasn't allowed to contact me, directly or indirectly. When he violated that with a barrage of calls and anonymous texts, the police had something new to log, clear evidence to go with the old. There was a moment in the middle of it all when I realized the true cleverness of what I'd been doing. The receipts, the timelines, the tiny documentation habits that had felt obsessive were becoming instruments. I photocopied the ledger and sent a formal demand letter to Greg via certified mail, a professional invoice for the months of household expenses I'd covered, with attachments, receipts, bank statements, and a crisp line that said, in effect, "You can pay this now, or you can meet a judge." He laughed at receiving it. He laughed in person at the courthouse steps like a man expecting to be coddled. He was served with court papers for a small claims case when I didn't get a response. He missed the hearing. The judge entered a default judgment in my favor, repayment for the expenses I had covered, plus court costs. It was not dramatic. It was a little sheet that said legal reality had tilted in my favor. But I confess to liking the irony more than the legalese. Greg had hidden a savings account while I bled into ours. Using the records I had, and with the court order, I worked with my lawyer to follow the money trail people like him leave. The transfers, the account numbers hidden behind benign labels, the suspicious savings that lined up with my months of being short. When banks get a sealed court order and a shiny default judgment, they don't like keeping money tangled in other people's drama. There was a handshake between legality and bookkeeping, and a portion of those hidden funds got processed back toward what they'd been siphoned from. The bank called me one afternoon and, in the same tone you use when telling someone their package has been delivered, told me a portion of the amount had been returned. It wasn't every penny. It wasn't a trip to a yacht. It was, however, plenty to patch the rent and buy me a couch that didn't come from a friend's hand-me-down pile. The climax of the revenge was, in its own way, quiet and bureaucratic. A certified mail envelope, a default judgment, a bank transfer that felt like justice dressed in practical clothes. There was no TV cameras, no triumphant monologue. I'd chosen to be meticulous rather than theatrical, and it paid off in the most adult way possible. Paperwork and money coming back to me. There were softer, harder moments embedded in the victory. Diane cried when I told her I wouldn't be bailing them out anymore until they accepted help. Not just from me, but from a budget counselor and from their own sense of responsibility. She asked if I hated them. I told her I missed them, but I did not miss being the punchline for their mismanagement. Elaine taught me how to say no with a kind voice and a locked door. She made soup and let me sleep without asking for explanations. Elaine's spare room became a shrine to small mercies. The rug that didn't match the curtains, the lamp that never worked quite right, and the sense that my life was mine again. After the restraining order, Greg attempted one last theatrically entitled act. He came by the old house to rearrange the mail, to assert some ownership of the narrative. The neighbors, the people who had watched us argue about minor things for years, saw him pacing with a catalog of boats and something like bewildered entitlement. They were not my army, but they were my witnesses. They had watched me cook pies and hand off envelopes, and now watched me walk past with a key to my own apartment and a small, decisive smile. It was small, but where I'd once been invisible in the background of their lives, now I was a person who could be seen choosing. 3 months later, I signed a lease on a place that smelled faintly of lemon and paint and the hopeful ambition of strangers' renovations. I bought a couch that I did not have to defend the right to sit on. I set up autopay for my utilities in my own name and scheduled a ridiculous-sounding weekend trip I'd been postponing for years. Financially, I was careful and relieved, not wealthy, but stable. Emotionally, I was cautious and clear. The house felt like mine. My mail, my plants, which I watered more regularly than Elaine's, my rules. Sometimes I think about the poetic justice I didn't shout from rooftops, the invoice in the courthouse file, the camera back on my desk, the way the bank returned money because the law does eventually notice patterns. These were my quiet thunder. Greg bought a little temporary dignity with his hidden savings. Then the court took its quiet slices back. Diane stopped calling me at 3 a.m. about things she could handle with a phone call and a signature. Our interactions dwindled into practical updates about mail forwarding and which of us would pick up what from the recycling. The revenge I chose wasn't to humiliate him in public so much as to reorganize the ledger of my life so it couldn't be rewritten by someone else. I did not gloat. I filed, I argued, I reclaimed. It felt, in the end, like installing a new lock on an old door. The lock doesn't scream. It's just firm. When I host my own Thanksgiving this year, small, a turkey that doesn't need to be a grand statement, but tastes honest, I'll set an extra plate at the table. Not for anyone I hated, but for the version of me that learned how to read a bank statement and say no, learned to document and then to ask for what was owed. I'll cook until the kitchen smells like sage and butter again, but this time the gratitude will be easier to taste. I'll sleep through the night without the thin knot of listening for footsteps. And if the mail brings another glossy boat catalog to the old house, I'll imagine Greg waving at it like an old man greeting a ship he cannot quite afford to man. There's a consolation I didn't expect. Independence tastes a lot like cooking for one and deciding to keep the leftovers. It's quiet, it's sensible, and it's mine.